With the recent mass shooting in Las Vegas, we've all heard the gun control advocates come out of the woodwork again. Because of this, I want to look over some statistics I found and made a video on years ago, but make it more concise and add some newer statistical findings. The US ranks number 12 when compared to European countries for mass shooting frequency and 11th for mass shooting fatalities, ranging from 2009 to 2015. This is despite the fact that the US has the highest gun ownership rate per capita in the world. I have a big problem with the way that mass killings are reported, because I've tried to find comparisons between mass killing statistics in different countries worldwide, but cannot. The only statistics that appear when trying to find mass killing statistics are mass shooting statistics, which means that attacks carried out by other means, such as with knives, bombs, or by running over a crowd of people with a vehicle, will not appear in those statistics. The reason it concerns me that mass killings that did not involve the use of a firearm are not included in mass shooting statistics is because it gives the impression that if there is stricter gun control, there are fewer mass killings. But as we've seen in recent years in European countries, with the migrant crisis has come a spate of mass killings using weapons other than firearms, such as knives, machetes, axes, IEDs, and automobiles, particularly trucks. And yet, despite the far stricter gun control and lower gun ownership per capita in European countries, they still experience mass shootings, such as Charlie Hebdo. Some gun control advocates may also point to suicide rates as a reason for stricter gun control. The US ranks number 48 worldwide in suicide rates, with every country that ranks above it having fewer guns per capita, particularly Japan, which ranks number 26 and ranks 162 in the world for gun ownership rates, with 0.6 guns per 100 people. And South Korea ranks number 10 in suicides, with a gun ownership ranking of 148 at 1.1 guns per 100 people. It is true that most people who attempt suicide and survive regret the attempt later, and that guns make it more difficult to survive an attempt. But I don't think that the government has any right to tell people, A, whether they are allowed to commit suicide, and B, by what means they are allowed to make that attempt, unless of course their means involves the harm or killing of others. Gun homicide rates in the US have been on the decline since 1993, which happens to coincide with the passing of the Brady Act, which required criminal background checks for gun sales. It's easy to see why denying gun ownership to criminals would lower homicide rates, if that in fact was the cause of the reduced homicide rates. The 90s are also notorious for the high rates of gang violence. Regardless, my view on the Brady Act may be considered somewhat extreme, as I think that everyone has a right to own a means of self-defense, even criminals, particularly non-violent offenders. I think that peace-loving vegan hippie who's never so much as punched another person, but used to sell weed in high school, has every right to own a means of self-defense. On the topic of violent offenders is where things get a little slippery for me. As I've said, I think everyone has a right to own a means of self-defense, but violent offenders give reason to believe that they may use that firearm to purposes other than self-defense, but even they still retain a right to self-defense. And to deny them that right to self-defense on the basis that they may harm someone else, even though that may be based on a history of violence, that is effectively treating them as though they are guilty of a crime before they have committed it. It also gets slippery in that everyone has a right to self-defense, but you don't have a right to own any property you please. The exchange of property is a voluntary transaction between a buyer and a seller. And if I want to buy a gun, but someone does not want to sell a gun to me, I don't have a right to that property, and they have not denied me my right to own property that I may use to defend myself or harm another. I still retain the right to obtain that property elsewhere. They have simply refused to sell me their property. So do I think that not selling someone a firearm is denying them their right to self-defense? Not precisely, It is denying them the most effective means of self-defense, and though everyone has a right to self-defense, they do not have a right to the property of another. By contrast, if we look at the homicide rates in the UK and Australia, two oft-cited examples of successful gun control legislation, the UK had a steep increase in homicide rates after 1997, and a ban on all handguns and non-sporting firearms. The homicide rates experience a downturn around 2002 and 2003. I'm not implying that the ban on handguns in the UK caused the increase in homicides, only noting the correlation. In Australia, the gun buyback program in 1996 seems to have had little effect on homicide rates, as they were already moving along a steady decline in homicide rates since sometime in the 80s. Here's a graph showing the homicide rates per 100,000 across all countries. The red line, which appears almost dead center of the graph, is the United States. To better visualize the gun ownership versus homicide rates of the world, here is a map which shows these values based on statistics from the Small Arms Survey of 2007 and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. When it comes to the topic of crime in the US, it's also worth noting that urban areas have higher crime rates than rural areas, despite the fact that rural areas have higher gun ownership rates. FBI crime statistics seem to show a strong correlation between population density and crime. And here is a graph from the Mises Institute, which shows gun ownership rates to homicide rates for each state in the US. And there seems to be no correlation between the two whatsoever. It just looks like a scatter shot. Now consider this. Roughly 1 in 3 Americans owns a gun. With a population of 323 million, that means that roughly 107.6 million people owns a gun. Now, I know I've been using old data throughout this video, but that's just because I'm too lazy to do the research on the new data, because I still remember how much time it took doing the research when I originally filmed the videos that I'm trying to summarize here. But the FBI just released their annual crime statistics for 2016 on September 26th, and it's fairly easy to find the new numbers on this one, so I'll go ahead and use the 2016 data. In 2016, there were 11,004 firearm murders. That means, if we're so generous as to grant gun control advocates that every single murder in the US was committed by a different person, that is, if the perpetrator to victim ratio is a perfect 1-to-1, then firearm homicides would represent roughly 0.01% of all gun owners. Now, there are also estimates that half of all Americans, though not gun owners, have immediate access to a gun. Doing the same calculation, that means that of the 161.5 million people with immediate access to a gun, 0.000681% of them committed a homicide. Again, that's being so generous as to assume that every person who committed a murder in 2016 only killed one person. Now onto the counter-argument made by gun rights advocates, which as far as I'm concerned doesn't even need to be true, since every person has a right to the means of self-defense. And I think that denying anyone the right to an equivalent or superior means of self-defense to those of their attacker is a violation of that right. I'm not even referring to the Second Amendment when talking about this either. A person's life is their property. No matter how little or how much a person owns, a person always has the right of ownership to their own life. If another person attempts to violate a person's right to the possession of their own life, which is their property, they have the right to take every measure necessary to defend their right to ownership of that property, being, of course, their right to live. If the Second Amendment didn't exist, and if there weren't an, in my opinion, idiotic debate over whether the Founding Fathers meant that people have the right to bear arms, or if their right to bear arms is necessary to the formation of a militia, I would still hold this to be true. There was a report conducted by a branch of the CDC at the request of Barack Obama on firearm violence in America. That report found from data collected by 19 independent studies that anywhere from 500,000 to 3 million Americans use their firearms in self-defense each year. Again, if we consider that 1/3 of Americans owns a gun, and half have immediate access to one, this means that even though 500,000 to 3 million sounds like a lot, it really means that only 0.4% of gun owners use their firearm defensively each year at the low end of the scale, and 2.7% of gun owners use their firearm defensively at the high end. If we calculate based on how many people have immediate access to a gun instead of own a gun, then that means that only 0.3% of people with immediate access to a gun used it defensively at the low end, and 1.8% at the high end. Those numbers aren't unreasonably large, but they are much larger than the 0.01 or 0.000681% of that same population that commit a homicide, which means that at its lowest, firearm self-defense is 30 times greater than firearm murder, and at its highest, 3,964 times greater. That's again if we consider those numbers as a percentage of the firearm owning or access to a firearm population. If we consider those numbers without regard to firearm ownership, then firearm self-defense is anywhere from 45 to 272 times greater than firearm homicide. Now, some skeptics of the 500,000 to 3 million uses of firearms defensively each year cite the NCVS, National Crime Victimization Survey, study that says that there are only 108,000 uses of a firearm in self-defense each year. If we consider this number, then firearm self-defense is only 9.8 times greater than firearm homicide, without any consideration to the percent of firearm ownership among the population. Using this number, 0.1% of firearm owners use their guns self-defensively, and 0.06% of people with access to a firearm use it self-defensively. This means that using this far more conservative number, firearm self-defense is anywhere from 6 to 146 times greater among the firearm-owning population. This means that using this far more conservative number, firearm self-defense is anywhere from 6 to 146 times greater among the firearm-owning or firearm-access population. But there is a problem with the NCVS study. And that problem is the entire reason that the 19 other independent studies which produced higher numbers exists. That reason is that the NCVS study is conducted in face-to-face interviews with officials of the U.S. Department of Justice, who don't even ask if the subject has used their firearm defensively. They are only asked if they've ever had to defend themselves against a crime. Any information regarding firearm use in that act of self-defense must be volunteered. And because laws surrounding where you are allowed to keep your gun, whether you are allowed to keep it on your person, how you are legally allowed to transport it, and when you are legally allowed to use it in self-defense can be strict dependent on your state, some firearm owners may not know when they are legally allowed to so much as draw their firearm. They may be reluctant to report to a federal agency out of concern that they may have broken a law. These flaws are all reasons that 19 separate independent surveys were conducted, and even they didn't manage to get full cooperation from subjects, despite not being government officials. The studies do suffer from flaws of their own, which are really unavoidable when it comes to research surveys. All things considered, the benefits of gun ownership seem to far outweigh its disadvantages.